Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome. My name is Melissa Nahn, President and CEO of the American Composers Orchestra, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's professional development session titled Tricks of the Trade, featuring Melinda Wagner. Today's session is part of Earshot, the nation's first systemic program for building relationships between orchestras and composers. Through orchestral readings, collaboratory fellowships, consortium commissions, and professional development, Earshot expands the definition of American orchestral music to ensure a vibrant and inclusive future. Earshot is a program of the American Composers Orchestra, completed in partnership with the American Composers Forum, the League of American Orchestras, and New Music USA. Composers for our Earshot readings are selected through an open call with no fee or age limit. We are delighted to welcome many of them here today, and all of our Earshot professional development sessions are open to the public. For the full schedule and list of topics, please visit us at americancomposers.org. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Garrett McQueen to the screen.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being here with us for this Tricks of the Trade Orchestration webinar. Orchestration is something that I certainly took in school. I'm sure that many of you took in school, but getting hands-on, real-time guidance and perspective from composers in the field is something that's completely invaluable, certainly from my view. So not only will we get some of that hands-on, real-time guidance from today's speaker as a composer, but also as a music lover. Our guest will be highlighting excerpts from the canon, as it were, to help contextualize some of her points and ideas, as well as offering a bit of perspective on some of her own music. I'm sure you may have many questions or comments that come to mind over the course of this presentation, so if you wouldn't mind offering those questions or comments using the Q&A function here on Zoom as we get going, we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. If you'd like to come on screen to ask your question at the end of today's presentation, feel free to use the hand raise function here on Zoom, and we'll bring as many of you on the screen as time allows. As a follow-up to this session, we'll be offering materials for you to review, which will be available at a later date, so be sure to check back and stay tuned for those. I'll also be offering a survey in the chat at the conclusion of today's presentation, so if you wouldn't mind clicking that link when it appears and offering your feedback, it will be much appreciated. And with that, I'd like to introduce to you today's featured speaker, celebrated as an eloquent, poetic voice in contemporary music by the American Record Guide. Melinda Wagner's esteemed catalog of works embodies music of exceptional beauty, power, and intelligence. Mindy received widespread attention with her colorful Concerto for Flute, Strings, and Percussion, which earned her the Pulitzer Prize in 1999. Since then, major works have included her Concerto for Trombone for Joe Alessi and the New York Philharmonic, a piano concerto titled Extremity of Sky, commissioned by the Chicago Symphony for Emanuel Ax, and Little Moonhead, composed for the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra as part of its popular New Brandenburgs project. Please help me welcome the one and only Melinda Wagner. Mindy, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to welcome all of you out there in Zoom land. And thank you so much to the American Composers Orchestra for inviting me to participate in this great webinar. I'm so happy to be able to share with you a couple of thoughts about orchestration. I think the first thing I want to say is I still don't consider myself to be a very good orchestrator. And I think that's because I still find it a struggle to get the sounds that I want. I'm continually learning new things about how to write for orchestra. Of course, the built-in problem is most composers don't get a chance to hear a new orchestra piece every other week. It's harder to get performances, and so the learning curve is a little bit slower. And that is the case with me, but I'm very, very happy to be able to share with you what I do know. And because I don't know who you all are, I will start with the no-brainer, and that is we really do all need to know the ranges of the instruments, but just as important, if not more important, is to know, and sometimes this happens through experience, to know what the tessitura of the instrument is. And tessitura often applies to singers. That is where in their range where they are most comfortable and where they most often will sing comfortably. So the same can be applied to instruments. For example, if you write for clarinet around the B above middle C area, that's fine, but it's sort of a namby-pamby range for the clarinet. Clarinets sound really, really wonderful up higher than that. And they sound really great lower than that. In the middle C neighborhood of the flute range, flutists can find those notes, but if you're writing a solo and you have competition in the orchestra, it's not going to be heard. Joe Alessi, when I was working on my trombone concerto, looked at the first few pages of that piece and said, are you going to be hanging out in this range for very long? And I said, no, why? Because I was writing a tune that was an octave below middle C, and I thought, well, I'm a former cellist. That is a really nice range for cello. And he said, well, at this dynamic, if you have me there very long, I'm going to pass out on stage. So learning all of these things is really great. Where are the sweet spots in the instruments? And it really is different for every section. And it takes a while. It takes a while to learn all of those things. Sometimes you have to make some mistakes before you get it right. The other sort of no-brainer is the harmonic series, which, as you know, goes from larger intervals, an octave, and progressively to smaller intervals. And partly because of this, if you're voicing a big chord, especially if you're writing tonal music, triadic music, it always sounds better to put the larger intervals in the lower instruments and the smaller intervals up until actual clusters in the upper instruments. So that's something that applies to almost any large ensemble voicing. Of course, I'm going to show you some examples that break that rule, which is pretty cool. Here's another thing that is also a no-brainer, but people don't really think about very much. And that is, first of all, with any piece, especially when you're trying to finish a piece and you're trying to set the tempo, remember that your piece has to go through the brain of a player, and from that brain into the instrument and through the air and across the stage and make it out to the audience. And all of those things slow down the actual moving from A to B, that is from your piece to the listener in the audience. So keep that in mind when you're setting a tempo for any group, orchestra, or even a solo piece, because often the tempos that sound great on your computer are going to be too fast in real life. So, but this is especially true with an orchestra. So when I was writing for the Chicago Symphony, I actually found it very useful to put sort of an aerial view of the orchestra on the stage. So I could really see what is the depth of this group. And if I wanted to write some kind of melody that was passed off to another instrument, how far away were they from each other? We don't really think about that so much. Oh, wow, I'm going to write a violin solo, and that soloist is going to pass off the melody to, I don't know, the vibraphone player in the back. That might be hard just because of the distance that the sound has to travel, but also sight lines from the players. So it sounds kind of mundane, but we do have to think about the physical properties of the group on stage. So yes, so tempo and pass-offs and solos. So all of this brings to mind what I thought a lot about early on, and that is writing for strings. And part of the reason I want to focus a little bit on that is they are in the front. They can never really hide. And also in a full orchestra, they are the largest section. The first violins can be up to 16 people. It's interesting to think about why that is. And what I've discovered is that strings really don't blend as well as wind instruments. If you were to see on a graph the actual waves of the sound, I think there's a lot more going on in terms of partials and everything buzzing with strings. So when you have just two players, let's say violins, it's very hard for them to blend. Their instruments, of course, they're trained to do this, and some are really, really good at it, but there's more of a solo aspect to it. Whereas two clarinetists, their training is about blending with each other, even though they are dealing with two different instruments, and you'll hear a slight color change. But the purity of the clarinet sound makes that a little easier, I think. So I think what we'll do, Garrett, is actually play a little snippet from a piece I wrote several years ago called Proceed Moon, which I wrote for the Chicago Symphony. And there's a section which sounds like one clarinet. That was the intention anyway. And it's a wonderful performance. So if we could just hear that, you don't need to see the score for that, just listen.
One moment here. All right, here we are. Beautiful, beautiful, Mindy. Oh, and you're muted. I'm sorry.
So thank you, Garrett. There was one spot where they did diverge, one spot, but those were two clarinets playing all the way through that excerpt. And I'm sure, you can hear a slight color change, of course, but in the score, they're dovetailed. And it's something that I think would be more difficult to do with a stringed instrument. I think probably there's string players out there who are really mad at me right now, but my tendency would be to write that kind of thing for a wind instrument. Okay, so strings. One thing about strings that I learned, and I'm from a generation of composers who sort of grew up listening to a lot of Alban Berg and actually a lot of Schoenberg too. And that music, which I still love, is nonetheless extremely dense, and it's very, very contrapuntal. So meaning there are just lots of individual melodies, themes, and all kinds of things going on at once. And I have found for myself that kind of detail in within the section of the first violin, say, doesn't come across very well. They are trained to play as a group and not so much to play contrapuntally within the section. So I've seen a lot of composers who are younger composers who are adding incredible detail to everything, including lots of extended techniques, which players are all becoming ever more comfortable with. But when it comes to too much detail in the orchestra, I think it's important to compromise to some degree so that your ideas can be heard and it's not just sort of a mess. So early on, I was just amazed. I remember just, I was just head over heels in love with Dutilleux when I was in college. And one thing that was so amazing about Dutilleux that set him aside from the more Germanic composers that I had listened to a lot was his writing for strings. And writing for divisi strings, meaning writing huge chords for one section in order to get not so much a chord, although that's true too, but a texture, a color. And I think that, well, actually, you know what, Garrett, we should do the Bartók first. Because that's actually that's an easier example to look at, I think. It's a piece, sorry, I skipped. It's a piece that I really love, 4 pieces for orchestra. We don't hear it very often. It's not played that often. But the opening has divisi strings. And the first violin, second violins are divisi A2. And what you can see is that they're interlocked, right? Meaning that the second's highest note is higher than the first violin's lower note. So I'm sure there's a subtle difference if you voice it a different way, but I think probably the intention is what the intention of getting kind of a very integrated, beautiful, and blended sound. And note that he has asked them to put on mutes, which tends to soften more of the partials to make it a purer sound. It's not just quieter, it's more pure in many ways. So you almost don't hear this chord at the beginning of the piece. I guess we could hear it now, Garrett. So Garrett, take a look at the next page. Notice here, and we just heard that, the first violins take over the melody in octaves up pretty high. And then we can start to hear individual sounds, and it sort of breaks away from that clustery sound. So I remember looking at that early on in my career, and then, of course, the Dutilleux. So let's take a look at that first page of the cello concerto. Wonderful recording done long ago by Rostropovich. So let's talk about these 3 pages. I think I have 3 of them. Notice now that it's divided the same way Bartók did. It's divided A2 for first and seconds, and cellos and violas. And what you really hear is a texture. Again, it's more of a color, it's a background sound. And I think the fact that he waited to bring this chord in, this cluster in, letting the cello play alone was brilliant. And as he kind of pulls apart these sounds, you start to hear, of course, more of the individual pitches. And the whole effect is, let's go to page 2. pulling apart the chord and actually adding pitches. Note that the violins are now divided with 3 on a part. My opinion is that 2 on a part wouldn't have worked. We would have heard too much of the individual player, but 3 on a part did the trick. And then if we go to the next page, here's the most beautiful moment, one of the most beautiful moments in music, where the entire chord is just blossoms. And if you can see, I mean, it's not a very, that was my phone, you know, I took the photo with my phone. There are harmonics on top, and it's from, you know, around the D below middle C, it's all filled in, but it's, we can really hear the harmony there. It just lights up. So let's listen to that. Ah. Thank you, Garrett. That's great. Just wondering if anyone has questions now. Oh, I see 13. Should we address those, or sort of midstream here?
Yeah, absolutely. While I negotiate bringing people on screen here, there
Sure.
was one question in the chat that I took note of. Earlier, you mentioned the difficulty of dovetailing strings as opposed to the clarinets. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to that.
I think if I were to put a fine point on it, dovetailing long suspended notes, especially if you're really careful with dynamics, is a wonderful effect, and it's totally possible to do that. To share, though, a single melody, the way I did with the clarinets, I at least would find that to be a little more challenging, just because of the nature of the instrument. So actually with the clarinets too, as I recall, I was very, very careful about slight crescendos and diminuendos as I dovetailed the instruments. I don't know, I mean, it's just something personally I wouldn't want to do so readily with strings, but and that might be a personal taste issue, but.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Stephanie has a question. Stephanie asks, how do we know when we really need to have 3 or 4 horns or multiple band instruments if writing only one part? What is a good rule of thumb? Or will an orchestra just have all of their horns play if they have more than one? Does this make sense? I play violin, so I'm not a pro with band instruments.
Oh, well, okay. Horns. Geez, well, with a full orchestra, traditionally there are 4. And with a chamber orchestra, there can be just one. So horns, by the way, can play very, very quietly. Just so you know, it's not just for playing, Wagner and, being dramatic. And or John Williams, a great lover of horns. But when they're all together, you can get a core harmony with horns and trombones too, that kind of supports a big string section. And if you want that kind of sound, and you're writing for a lot of strings in a large orchestra, you're going to want, I think, all four, because the range of horns is really, really wide, and you can cover a lot. But it's also the sound that can blend so well. Horns are great for just sort of being this core harmonic sound that sometimes is more sensed than heard. So deciding, it depends on how big you want to get. Hello? Okay.
Yeah, RC, please ask your question.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was on. Percussion writing is hard for me, only because it was never stressed in school as a large section to be used constantly or with such a presence that it was a real equal. I find it difficult, and yet I'm looking at pieces that quote unquote win competitions and are selected for the ACO that have a real percussion presence. Can you give me any advice on how to wrap my head around it?
Around percussion? I'm not sure
about the current writing of percussion in orchestral situations.
Okay. Well, you know what? We could spend hours and hours and hours talking about percussion, because just think about the fact that a single percussionist has to be proficient on hundreds of instruments. I mean, literally, each one with its own techniques and form, right? So, and with many of those instruments come a whole array of different mallets, right? So it's a very, very complicated topic, and it's a great topic. I love percussion. How to write for percussion. I'll tell you how I learned a little bit about it, and I can't say that I've crossed the finish line, not in any way, shape, or form. But I was allowed, because my husband is a percussionist, he snuck me in to a lot of rehearsals, and I sat in the back of the orchestra and just watched, because I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but one thing that we have to think about when writing for percussion is the choreography involved, moving from one instrument to the next. There's always the danger of dropping a mallet or dropping the music, or if you have the percussionist moving around too much, that danger goes up in the odds. And also, if you have percussionists crossing each other on stage, then you really have the sort of a train wreck waiting to happen. So I learned so much by watching them move around each other, move around their instruments, and put one set of mallets down to pick up another. And that is one thing I think every composer should have a chance to do, is to just watch. Often we're in readings, even we're placed in front of the strings and don't get a chance to even see percussionists. So it takes a lot of work to figure out all of the stuff that's going on back there, and to learn the basic instruments like tambourine, bass drum, let's say, and triangle, were the basic toys, so to speak. And then you add the mallet instruments in there, and all the different mallets, hard to soft to medium. It just takes a while, but it does take some elbow grease on the part of the composer.
Mindy, you're mentioning your husband reminds me of a question that I often ask composers. I ask them, well, how do you negotiate learning ranges of instruments, timbres of instruments, what lays down well, what doesn't, beyond what's in the textbook? And the answer that I always get is some variation of, well, buy your trombone playing friend a coffee and just spend an hour together. I wonder if you share that perspective.
Absolutely. The more we hear, I mean, we could read about it until we're blue in the face and might be able to memorize a lot of things, but really getting to know the instruments involves listening to a lot of music. YouTube actually is really fantastic, a really fantastic resource for composers, because not only can we check out different techniques, but brass players are only too happy to show you their mutes and how they differ from each other in sound. The only problem is you're not guaranteed that the player is actually really good, but it's great to try. There's a lot there that didn't used to be. The other thing is recordings, of course. The big go-to wonderful orchestrators like Ravel, Respighi, just go to the score and steal from the best. Figure out why this sounds so good here. Why is this, giving me goosebumps? Why does the orchestra sound so resonant and beautiful? And figure out, well, what did the composer do to make that happen? And that's true, of course, of solo instruments. Some melodies just don't lay right on the oboe. And I think you only find out that by listening to a lot of oboe. So yes, lots of work and time involved, but hopefully it would be enjoyable for all of you.
And maybe similar to listening to a lot of music, there's a question here. How do you incorporate score study into your process?
Gosh, everybody is different when it comes to that, but I find that most people I know like to listen first without a score, just to get the sound of the piece without the distraction of following along and turning pages or scrolling. I would say listen a few times and then go to the score after you already have the sound of the piece sort of in your ear. And then, then follow along and see, wow, the color is changing here. There's sort of a formal event here. Did the composer use orchestration to make that audible to me? So, and notice things like that intrigue you.
Thank you for that. Lily
Sure.
has a question. Lily, please, if you're able.
Hi, I have a question. What are the homogeneous orchestration and heterogeneous orchestration? What's the difference between them?
Oh gosh, I'm not sure I understand your question. Could you maybe pose it a different way?
Yes, I posted the question in the chat.
I'm sorry, there's so many questions in the chat. I'm gonna have to, you are Lily, right?
Yes.
I am not finding you.
I'll repost Lily's question for you here.
Okay.
All right, there we are.
You know what? Okay. These are terms maybe you learned in school, but no, I'm not familiar with those terms. I would guess that one refers to more contrapuntal orchestration, meaning a more sense of individuality within the section, as opposed to orchestrating music according to sections, which is actually more old school, I think. When early on, when you're learning orchestration, you learn to keep each section within itself and not mix things up too much. But I'm guessing that that's what you mean. What do I think about them? it's great to know about both.
Great, thank you so much. There's a question here from Hugh. Hugh asks, an area I have difficulty in getting familiar with is how the overtones of different instruments affect their relationship with other instruments. This seems to be a huge topic that obviously can't be covered in details in a session like this, but I wonder if there are some good references on this subject to study.
Oh gosh, well, certain instruments, you wouldn't want to voice a chord, say, with two oboes playing high in the range and very, very close together, like a semitone. You're going to hear actual beats in that sound because they just don't blend the way you might want. As for a resource or a text to recommend to you, I think probably any recent orchestration book. We actually, the orchestration book by Samuel Adler, which is not recent, but it's pretty reliable. So I would recommend that.
In preparation for this webinar, Mindy, I remember you're speaking to use of strings, generally speaking, the idea that the string section as a whole has to always be doing something. I wonder if you can speak to that again.
Well, sure. I noticed that there's a tendency, even in myself, to have the strings always playing. They're at the bottom of the score, and sometimes it kind of looks funny to see just white space there when you're writing a piece. There's almost a guilt factor in leaving instruments out for too long. I would say that that's a little bit of a trap. But in any case, I've been paying more attention to that with my own students. It's possible to leave strings out and remember, not for long stretches, I guess, but it depends on the piece, of course, but remember that you're seeing, the audience is not only hearing the piece, but they're seeing all this sawing away all the time. And I think it actually can be distracting, but they're in the front too. So a piece does not have to be string heavy all of the time. And I think using contrast with that you get from leaving them out once in a while is great. But there is a tendency to want them to play all the time, all music all the time.
Washington, please, you have the floor.
Oh, hello. Thank you so much for this. My question has to do with strings playing intervals that are higher up in the chord, say the 9ths, the 11ths, 13ths, things like that. I'm wondering if they are as adept at the intonation aspect of this as horn players are, not horn, wind instruments are.
You mean playing intervals together, like two?
Yes.
Well, of course, that this is a part of the training is to tune those. I mean, if you were not using microtones to tune those intervals, I think professional players are actually very good at it. I thought maybe you were talking about double stops, which is another topic entirely, but I would say it up high. If you have, it's very similar to the oboes. You might not want to place two parts to semitone apart, way up high, because that is a little harder for us to hear, unless you want, a very kind of aggressive sound, a little bit ear splitting, I think.
Thank you.
Sure.
I didn't recognize your email, but I recognized your voice. Thank you so much, Salim, who's calling in from South Africa today. Thank you so
Very
much.
nice.
A couple more questions here. I'll bring a couple more people to the front here. Nina, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, I'm Nina Sinyakova. I'm a composer and a pianist based in Philadelphia. And first, Ms. Wagner, I want to thank you for the most clear explanation, for terrific, sharp, to-the-point answers. I've been of an elderly generation and very contemporary, and all of that speaks to me, absolutely. A question, how do you overcome a challenge when someone asks you to write for an instrument or combination of instruments that doesn't speak to you at all? So they ask, can you write for that? And you say, gosh, what am I going to do about it? As an example, I try to stay away from woodwind quintet is because of the load of Stravinsky and because of the load of cartoon-like sound. I believe I have overcome it, so I have my methods. I'm curious about yours when you had this feeling, what am I going to do with that? And the result was a very successful piece.
Thank you, Nina. May I ask that people who aren't speaking mute themselves? Thank you, that's great. Well, we're asked all the time to compose for instruments that might be not as familiar to us, for one thing. And then, of course, we always pick on the woodwind quintet. And Ligeti actually handled that by not having them all in his quintet, not having them all play together ever. They were, lots of solos, which I thought was a pretty good way to handle some of the tuning problems with that particular ensemble. But, first of all, do your homework, and again, listen to the instruments, and then some of it, this is our life, right? It's a lot of educated guessing, imagination. Imagine how one sound will go with another, one instrument will go with another, and you know what? Sometimes we're going to make mistakes, and of course, that's not fun, but we learn from them. But a lot of it is just imagining what it would sound like in our heads, and I think that to go into a new piece without guarantees is really a healthy thing for us, and it keeps us it keeps us being creative to imagine the sounds. So, but an example for me, a long time ago, I was asked to write for acoustic guitar, a solo guitar piece. Well, we're not really taught about guitar. That's not the first instrument we learn about in school. And I really didn't know anything about it. So I borrowed a guitar actually from my father-in-law, and I sat with it on my lap and made sure that the sounds I was hearing, were actually possible to perform, because some of the things that I asked the guitarist to do, it was impossible to reach. So it was very good to have that instrument in my lap. Now we can't always have a trombone or a double bass in our lap, but I think using our imaginations based on what we know is really, really important and not talked about enough.
Werner, please, thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This is some question I always like to ask, but it's just hard to find composers that write concertos because it's not very common. I myself wrote a violin concerto, and after that, it was very much more like making a film. So I'd like to ask you, because I listened to your trombone concerto in a recording when I was working at Theodore Press a long time ago.
Oh.
I'd like to ask you, if you write like a 30-minute concerto of any kind, did you end up like writing more music? Like, did you end up like writing like probably like 45 minutes, but you just had like, deleted music that just didn't fit the composition? Like, maybe some that just dragged too long, or like a filmmaker, you have like deleted scenes. Because with my concerto, I had so much stuff that I really loved, but I just just didn't fit the composition. Like it just didn't fit the narrative. I had to cut it out. Yeah. And then, because I was just editing the piece. So I'd like to ask you, like, did you actually, when we heard your concerto, it was probably around 20 to 30 minutes or something like that. But I'd like to ask you, did you actually write more music behind? Like, you had like maybe 20 more minutes that were left out?
No. I do like to think of composers as being of two kinds. One, and I like to think about those two kinds in terms of sculpture. All right. There are there are two ways we can go about sculpting something, and that is the additive process, where we start with just a wire or a stand or just something to hold the clay up or whatever, and we add onto this. And I'm thinking of clay, let's say. We add onto it to get our shape, right? Then you have a sculptor like Rodin, who starts with a big block of marble and carves away at it, okay? So I would say that most composers do a little bit of both of these things, but you're talking about writing a lot of music and then carving away to make the proportions right. I've actually never written 40 minutes of music that I had to cut, because that's an awful lot of music, but I have written music that was too long in spots, and music that I liked, but that would have ruined the proportions of sections or the shape of it if I had kept it in. So we're really talking about composing now more than orchestra. I mean, we're not talking about orchestration at all. It's more of a compositional issue, but deciding what not to write is just as important, well, almost as important as what you decide to put down on the final draft. So carving away is, if you are that kind of composer, is really, really important. And sometimes it's painful, right? Because you have to say goodbye to music that you really loved. So it is a compromise. But no, I've never written that much music and had to put a lot of it on the cutting room floor. No.
Thank you for that question. There's a question in the chat that really resonates with me. Audrey asks, as a frequent second bassoonist, I'm always fascinated how different composers treat this role. How do you find yourself using the second bassoon? You know, Mindy, as a person who made a living for a decade as a second bassoonist, you know, I think it's interesting to think about the musicians of the orchestra, the roles that they expect to play in a piece of music, and maybe how that may be different than what a composer decides to give the second bassoonist, or the last stand of the seconds, or something along those lines.
Right, right. Well, I love bassoon, and thinking back, I don't consider that set up to be a hierarchy of any kind. First bassoon, second bassoon. In part because, you know, my music has a lot of notes. It's pretty busy. So bassoons are great for actually passing off a long, long phrase with lots of notes, of sharing that. And it's a really important thing to learn. When you have a very extended phrase for bassoon, you got to give them a chance to breathe, for one thing. So I usually treat bassoon 1 and 2 as partners. Of passing off long phrases, just, you know, quite similar to the clarinet piece that I played for you, clarinet part that I played for you. So, but then when you're dealing with the more vertical aspects of composing, bassoon is really, really, really important in fleshing out the harmony.
Max has a question. Max asks, how intertwined are orchestration and composition in your process? Do you begin orchestrating from the start, or do you tend to write music that you end up orchestrating later?
Okay, you know what? That's a really, really good question, because first of all, I do think it's a matter of personal taste. You know, it's a matter of what works for you. But one of my colleagues always writes in short score, meaning it's a reduced orchestra on the page, and later goes in and fleshes that all out on the full page score. I could not possibly do that, because I like to see the space when instruments are not playing. That helps me sort of keep track of the shape of things and sort of the peaks and valleys of the piece. Does that answer your question? My preference is to actually orchestrate as I'm going along. I mean, I'm not separating them at all.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I don't see any more questions, and we have a few more minutes. Maybe people need a couple more minutes to think of another question, but we haven't yet looked at the de Tillieu violin concerto that you offer. Maybe we could spend a minute or two with your thoughts on that work.
Let's do that. We just kind of got carried away, right? So it's a more recent piece, the de Tillieu violin concerto. It's Isaac Stern playing in this recording. And it's similar in lots of ways to the cello concerto, except now he starts with the lowest strings in a cluster. And really it is more of a texture, more of a color than it is an actual chord, which makes for a really mysterious and dark sound, which I love. Go to the next page. Thank you. Yes, I saw someone commenting the harmonics in the upper strings with the cymbal is a great combination. And you don't hear really one over the other. It's more of the combination that is so great, as if they could never be apart again. And it just gives a little tiny metallic taste to it, which is quite lovely. So for those of you, who want to learn more about strings, look at these two pieces. Actually, almost anything that de Tillieu has written with strings is instructive to any composer. And he wasn't tremendously prolific. He really, I wouldn't say struggled, but he really was so meticulous about these pieces, every single little detail, and much of it written by hand, by the way. So,
and you've actually, and it looks like you've inspired a string question here. So,
okay.
Mo asks, do you have any advice for writing for individual string instruments? I'm a double bassist, and I'm working on writing music for string quintet, regular quartet plus bass, like Dvorak's Opus 77. I'm curious about subjects like blending and balance between the strings for dense harmonies and for sections where part of the quintet is pizzicato and part arco.
Well, again, that's a question of your own personal taste, is, the kind of sound you're after. If you are after a dark, growly sound, then yeah, put clusters down low. I mean, that's a great sound. With double stops, you can really flesh out the harmony with just a few strings. For those of you who might not know, double stops are playing two strings at once, and various fingerings will get you various intervals. So, pizzicato is a great, almost percussive effect, and it's can be sometimes more sense than heard, again, but it can be extremely loud and persistent too. So again, it's a personal choice. But listen to a lot of string quartets and string quintets. I mean, that is, I could speak all day about this, but the best thing to do is to listen and choose the sounds that you like and then make them yours compositionally.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. You touched on this subject closer to the beginning of the presentation, but I'd like to return to it just for us to expound a little bit more. You spoke to the difference between hearing a crescendo on the screen or the passage of, a melody from the concert master to the tuba, and how that works in on paper, but best practices on realizing how it actually manifests when you have musicians who are 20 feet apart or maybe may have difficulty hearing each other.
Right. Well, first of all, they have to see each other, right? They have to be able to look into the eyes of the other player to organize all of that. It's not just a conductor issue. So if they don't have the sight lines, they're going blind, really. I mean, they're doing it blind. So, and I'm sure there are examples of, so-called pass-offs that are from one end of the stage to the other, but I would try, I mean, my own personal view is that it's probably safer if they have sight lines, if they can see each other. And that is, regardless of the actual combination of sounds. So violin and tuba, it's hard to make that one work, but.
Maybe not impossible, but certainly difficult.
Impossible.
Well, we're getting close to our time, Mindy. I'd like to thank you again for spending this hour with us, answering questions and offering your insights. We've already identified Samuel Adler's orchestration book as a great resource. Are there any other resources that you might suggest to people listening and watching today?
Well, one really good book, and this is not so much orchestration, is more notation, is Behind Bars or Behind the Bars. I've forgotten which one, but that's something that you can download, buy online, and it gives you every possible thing you'd want to know about how to notate the sounds you're after. And that also refers to extended techniques, harmonics, and so on. So that's a book that's important for every composer to have on hand.
Great. And there's one last question that I think is actually a pretty good question. Johnny asks, will you adjust dynamics on the fly depending on if it's a concert hall or a recording stage?
Oh, wow. Probably. Yeah. Probably according to the placement of the mics and all of that. I mean, a studio recording is it's a different project altogether, because then you have the ability to mix the recording and to fix levels and all of that after it's already happened. So it's a little more guaranteed, right? But dynamics, wow, that's another webinar, because they are two very different according to what section you're talking about or what part of the piece. So going from mezzo piano to mezzo forte is a really small distance. So if you want something like that to be really recognizable, then make the contrast more apparent. So, but yeah, I mean, studio recordings that's a different project altogether.
Well, Mindy, once again, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today. If you will bring your attention over to the chat, I've just posted a link to a survey for today's webinar. So if you wouldn't mind, please click that link and let us know what you thought. Give us your feedback. And with that, I'd like to invite Melissa back to the stage to give us a closer. Thank you so much, Mindy, again.
Thank you.
Hooray. Thank you so much, Mindy. That was amazing. Thank you, Garrett. I also want to give a special thanks to the Stephen R. Gerber Trust for supporting Earshot. This workshop is actually an evergreen session for us every year. It was inspired by an article that Stephen Gerber wrote for New Music Box called Tricks of the Trade, where he was sharing how, as a composer, his best teacher oftentimes were scores that he loved, and being able to look at how composers accomplished what they did through orchestration by looking at the documents they created through their scores was such an inspiration. So we'll make sure to send that out with the follow-up materials. from today. And we would also love to welcome you back to our next session on February 22nd at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time. That is on rehearsal techniques with Lina Gonzalez-Granados and Nina Shaker. And I'd also like to offer another huge thanks to our Earshot partners, American Composers Forum, New Music USA, and the League of American Orchestras. We're also very grateful to the many individuals and organizations who have made Earshot possible through their support, and to ACO's artists, staff, and board for making this program a reality. For more information on Earshot, including how you can apply as a composer or connect with us to bring the program to your orchestra, as well as the full list of our supporters, visit us at americancomposers.org. And for now, thank you and have a wonderful evening.